Now I want to look at where is your pelvis in relation to your ankles. So if you sat down, you're going to need to stand back up, and you're going to want to have your plumb line again. And I want you to hold your plumb line in the center of your hip, so on the side, and I want you to feel from the top of your pelvis down the sides of your pelvis, so past the fleshy area of the hips, right at the very top of your thigh bone, at the top of your femur. If you bend your knee and lift your foot off the floor a little bit, you'll feel a bony structure moving underneath your fingers. It's like a bony knob if you dig a bit. That's where I want you to anchor the top of your plumb line. And then again, allow the weight to fall down towards the floor, but not touch the floor, along the side of your leg. And just notice, where does the bottom of the plumb line fall in relation to your foot? So is it more towards the front of the foot, more towards the center, or more over your heels? And you can play with this. Go ahead and allow your pelvis to drift way forward so that the plumb line also goes forward, or the bottom of the plumb line does. And then shift a little bit back over the center of your foot. And then now I want you to shift your pelvis back so that the bottom end of the plumb line falls right alongside the outside edge of your ankle. And in particular, the bony knob on the outside of your ankle, called your lateral malleolus, is where I want the bottom of your plumb line to fall. So the image on the right is demonstrating how I would like your pelvis to be stacked over your ankle. How different does this feel to you compared to how you typically stand? And you may feel, if you do tend to have your weight, your pelvis shifted more forward, this will most likely feel like you're sticking your butt out behind you. And it would be really common for you to feel like you're going to fall backwards. The reason being, when we shift our pelvis forward, we allow our shoulders to come back behind us to counterbalance us so that we don't fall forward. When we back the pelvis up so that it's now stacked over the ankles, we have to bring the torso forward, bring the shoulders over the pelvis. Otherwise, we're going to feel like we're falling backwards. It can help to have a mirror so that you get some visual input to what you're noticing. This can feel really, really strange to people, especially if you've spent a lifetime moving through your world with your pelvis shifted forward and your shoulders shifted back. Another piece that can factor into why this feels so unstable is when you stand with your pelvis shifted forward, you're relying more on your quadricep muscles, those muscles on the front of your thigh, as well as your psoas muscles, which attach to your low back area, the vertebrae of your low back, and they cross the front of your pelvis. They're designed to help stabilize your spine. So when we stand with our pelvis shifted forward, we're asking the quadriceps and the psoas muscles to help stabilize us. And the muscles on the back side, the glutes and the hamstrings, are kind of on vacation. They're really not being asked to do much of anything. When we back our pelvis up so that it's stacked over the ankles, then we're needing to use more glutes and more hamstrings, less quads and less psoas to keep us upright. So we're balancing out the workload. This also puts the pelvis in a position where we can use the glutes when we walk and move throughout our day. When the pelvis is shifted forward, it's slightly tucked under as well, and that interferes, that's the word I want, that interferes with the glutes being able to generate the force that is needed. So again, when we stand, pelvis stacked over the ankles, we are putting the pelvis in a position that allows for the glutes to be an active participant, especially as we walk, depending on how we walk, which I'll get into shortly. But we're setting ourselves up well when we have the pelvis stacked over the ankles and not shifted forward. And we're also being able to access the hamstrings, as I mentioned. So those muscles on the back side of the legs are really, really key and for pelvic floor function, and they're really neglected. They are but a shadow of what would be ideal for most people. All right, I talked earlier about how we were going to do an evaluation specifically for the muscles on the sides of the pelvis, the gluteus medius muscles, and that time has now arrived. So I want you, hopefully you're still standing, and if not, come back. So you're in a standing position, and you're going to have the outside edges of your feet straight. You're going to have the width of your ankles matching the width of the front of your pelvis. And I want you to shift your weight over your right leg so that your weight bearing over the right side, over your right leg. And from here, I want you to push down through the right heel, down through the right hip, as if you're pushing the floor away from you. And in the process of doing that, I want you to float your left foot off of the floor. So you're pushing down through your right leg to float the left foot off of the floor. And I want you to notice, first of all, how easy or how challenging is this for you? And then I want you to check in with, did your pelvis shift forward? Or are you able to keep your pelvis stacked over your ankle? I want you to also notice, is your pelvis twisting open towards your left? So are you able to keep your pelvis facing directly forward, or is it wanting to drift over and open out to the left? And then go ahead and bring the left foot back in contact with the floor. Check that your feet haven't crept into a turned out position. And if they have, go ahead and get the outside edges straightened again. And then we're going to shift your weight over your left foot. So now your weight bearing predominantly on that left side. And from here, check in before we push down with the leg. I want you to really check in and make sure that your pelvis is stacked over your ankle. Then push down through the heel, through the left side of your pelvis, and float your right leg off of the floor. It is really common for you to have a different amount of strength on each side, so you may notice one side is much more challenging than another. Again, we're looking to see, are you able to maintain the position of your pelvis over your heel or over the ankle? How steady do you feel? Notice if you have a tendency for the pelvis to open out towards the right. And also check that you're not bending your right knee so that, hey, I'm floating my foot off the floor, but I'm really just bending my knee to make it look that way. So we want both knees to remain straight throughout this process. And then go ahead and bring the foot down. You can also do this on a block. So if this was really challenging for you to do on the floor, try it again standing on a book, a phone book, a yoga block. because you may not yet have the strength in those muscles to be able to elevate the foot off of the floor. And if you stand on a block, you don't have to be able to do that, but you can start to engage the gluteus medius muscles and start to strengthen them in the process. So once again, here we are looking at the gluteus medius muscles, which is what we're focusing on with this particular exercise. So we're evaluating your strength. What's the strength of your gluteus medius muscles? If this was really hard for you, which it is for most people, so no, number one, you are not alone if you struggled in doing this. And most, like I said, most people are really weak in this. And number two, doing this is one of the ways that you help to strengthen this muscle. We need these muscles to be strong to stabilize the pelvis and to allow the gluteus maximus to do their job. Ideally, when we're walking, we are listing, this is called a pelvic list, what we just did. We are listing with every step that we take. And in the process of listing with every step that we take, we are asking the gluteus medius to work. So every step becomes a strengthening opportunity for the gluteus medius muscles, and it sets up the gluteus maximus muscles to participate in our walking process. All right, next we're going to take a look at your hamstrings. So the first thing I want you to do is get yourself bent over so that you're able to put your hands on the ground. And whatever you have to do to accomplish that. So if your knees bend, that's fine. Your back's obviously going to bend. And if that's too much for you, then please don't go that far down. But I just want you to notice, what's it like for you to try and get your hands on the floor, and or what's it like to get your hands on the floor? And what do you have to do to achieve that? Once you're there, notice how it feels. How tight do your hamstrings feel? How much sensation are you aware of in the backs of your legs? And then go ahead and slowly come up and out of that into an upright position. We're going to fine-tune that, but before we fine-tune that, I want to take a closer look at the attachment points of the hamstring muscles. So the hamstrings, they cross two joints. They cross the hip joint and they cross the knee joint. They have one attachment point on the base of the pelvis, so the ischial tuberosities, the sit bones that I'm asking you to now and forever use to support your weight when you sit. That is one of their attachment points. And then they run down the back of the leg and they cross the knee and they attach below the knee. When we are in a bent knee position, we are placing the hamstrings in a shortened position. So we're moving the attachment points closer to each other. When we allow the pelvis to move, we are changing the distance between the upper attachment point and the lower attachment point. We can also fake hamstring length by using our back instead of moving the pelvis. So when we bend forward, if we're looking at a forward bend in terms of accurately reflecting the length that we have available to us in our hamstrings, in order to do that, we have to move the attachment points away from each other. And we know we're moving the attachment points away from each other. If our knees are straight, so we've got a solid anchor for the lower attachment point, and then as we bend forward, we are tipping the pelvis forward. And in the process of tipping the pelvis forward, we're bringing the upper attachment point further away, or we're bringing it away from the lower attachment point. So go ahead and, if you're in the privacy of your own home, go ahead and place your hands underneath your butt cheeks to feel the bottom of your pelvis. And as you hinge forward, you should notice that bony part moving up, so that it's the bottom, it's that attachment point on the bottom of your pelvis that is now moving up and away from the attachment point on your knee. So now, let's put in some parameters for the forward bend. As you're standing, I want you to feel your low back area and notice the curve in your low back, your lumbar curve. Go ahead and keep a hand there as you do this. As you bend forward, all I want you to do is hinge at the hips. I don't want anything to change with the curves of your spine. If you start to feel this valley in your low back round out, if you lose your valley in your low back, you have exceeded your boundaries for the length that your hamstrings have available. Because what happens at that point, when you start to lose the curve in your low back, we know that you're actually rounding your spine, and it's your spine that's traveling farther forward, not the base of your pelvis lifting up to tip you forward. Okay? So go ahead and hand on the low back, keeping track of your lumbar curve, and hinge forward at your hip joint, only to the point at which you can maintain that curve. Once you start to feel that flattening out and rounding out a little bit underneath your hand, stop and back up. That is the boundary of the length of your hamstrings. Because we know at the point at which your pelvis is no longer able to tilt forward is the end of the available length in your hamstrings. Now that's probably quite different than the length that you thought you had available to you. Because we tend to use our spine. When we bend forward, we're allowing the spine to curve forward, which is compensating or masking lack of length in the hamstrings. Now, why do we care about how long our hamstrings are? Well, as we saw earlier, the hamstrings cross the hip joint, they also cross the knee joint. When we have short, tight hamstrings, which we tend to do because we spend so much time in a seated position, which puts the hamstrings in a shortened position, when we stand up, we have a tendency to stand with a slight bend in our knee and with a pelvis that's tucked forward, or tucked under, I should say. Because tucking the pelvis under and bending the knees helps to make up for the lack of length in the hamstrings. So it's one of the ways that we compensate for lack of length in the hamstrings is by having a bend in the knees and by shifting the position of the pelvis. It's putting a little bit of slack in the hamstrings, except we don't really have slack, we just lack length. And when we have a tucked pelvis, as I talked about earlier, that decreases the ability of the gluteus maximus muscles to be able to function. So once again, all roads are leading to the gluteus maximus. Not really, but, and that was not a pun intended there. We need to look at how we move and what is compromising our ability to move well. Hamstring length is one factor in that picture. All right, it is now time for the final evaluation. This one is my favorite, I will say. Before we do that, I want to orient you to the landmarks that we're going to be using. So we have, in this image here, we're looking at the front of the pelvis, and we're going to be using 3 landmarks. The left and right ASIS, which are the top points of the triangle, and then the pubic symphysis, which is the bottom point of the triangle. Now, I'm going to have you go ahead and lie down on the floor, face down. And I want you to notice, as you get situated, and feel free to place your hands underneath your face so that you're more comfortable. I want you to notice what kind of contact you're making with those 3 points. Are there any points that aren't making contact with the floor? So first, notice that. And you may notice, oh wow, my pubic symphysis is nowhere to be found in relation to the floor. Or you may notice that your ASIS are not making contact. It would also be somewhat common, or certainly a possibility, to notice that one side is making more contact than the other. So you may notice you feel more contact with the left ASIS compared to the right, or vice versa. So you're just evaluating, you're just gathering data at this point. And I want you to notice if all 3 of those points are not making contact equally with the floor, I want you to do what you need to do, contract what you need to contract, to make all 3 of those points have even contact with the floor. So just notice, what do you have to do to make that happen? And then go ahead and relax and notice, once again, what your default is. So now, from the default, without changing anything. So the contact that you're currently making is the contact I want you to maintain throughout this evaluation. And what I want you to do now is to lift the front of your thigh with a straight leg. I want you to lift the front of your thigh off the floor without changing anything about the pelvic triangle. And notice, how high can you get it off the floor? How easy, how difficult is it for you? What do you want to do in terms of managing your pelvis? How much do you have to work to manage your pelvis so that you don't change the contact between your pelvis and the floor? And then go ahead and lower the leg down. And we're going to check the other side. And again, be really mindful that you're not allowing your knee to bend as you do this. And I'm also going to add in another piece, that you are flexing your foot. So I want your foot in the same position it would be in if you were standing on it. And go ahead and lift your left front of your thigh off of the floor. And you're most likely feeling your glutes contracting to do this and your hamstrings contracting to do this. Notice how the second side compares to the first side. Which one was easier for you? And go ahead and lower that leg down. Now, we're going to add in another piece to this. And that piece is going to start with placing your hand over your low back area. And I want you to notice, in this ideally relaxed position, so you're just letting the floor support the weight of your legs, what's the state of your low back in terms of muscle tension? Do you feel kind of ropey muscles down either side of your spine? In a more tense situation, you'll feel these really noticeable mounds of muscle on either side of the spine, and then this kind of valley where you dip down and find the bony landmark of your vertebrae. If you're noticing tight mounds of muscles on either side of your spine, is it possible for you to relax them? And you can use your hand there as kind of a cue to your brain to orient to what's going on there. Now, from this position, without changing anything underneath your hand, without engaging and contracting those muscles there, I want you to repeat lifting the right front of your thigh off of the floor. And again, I want you to do that without changing anything between your pelvis and the floor, so you're maintaining that same amount of contact, and without engaging, without contracting the muscles in your back that are underneath your hand. And it would be really, really common for you to kind of feel like your brain gears are grinding and you don't know how to move without engaging those muscles in your back. And go ahead and lower that right leg down to the floor. And we're going to do this same thing on the left side. Now this time on the left side, I want you to only lift your leg as much as you can without engaging those muscles in your back underneath your hand. And you may find that they kick on immediately and you're barely able to change the amount of weight that is making contact with the floor, let alone get the front of that left thigh off the floor. And that's fine. That's your edge, shall we say. And just notice, what can you do, and at what point do your back muscles start to engage? And then let the left leg fully relax into the floor. You may be wondering, what in the world is going on here? Well, we have a few things. We've got a tendency for a lot of tension in the front of the hip joint, in the muscles called the hip flexors. These are the muscles that allow you, when you're standing, to bend at the hip. So if you're going to lift your leg as if you were marching in place, the muscles in the crease of your hip where it's bending, those muscles that cross that area are called your hip flexors. Because we spend so much time in a seated position, the hip flexors tend to be short and tight. So we have a tendency for that pattern. That's one piece of this puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle is we're notoriously weak in our glutes and our hamstrings, as we've seen throughout our time together. And so we have a lot of tension in the front of the hip joint, and we have weakness in the glutes and the hamstrings. Not only do the glutes and hamstrings then need to be strong enough to lift the weight of the leg off the floor, but then they need to be strong enough to overpower the tension in the front of the hip to be able to do that. Typically, they're not strong enough to do that. So what ends up happening is we recruit the muscles in our low back to help us accomplish that. Which means that quite often we are moving throughout our day with back muscles that are doing more than their fair share of the workload. So we want to shift this pattern because it's really important that we have the ability to move into hip extension, which is what we're testing for when we did this evaluation. We're looking to see what is your ability to move your leg back behind your pelvis So without changing the position of your pelvis and just isolating that movement at the hip joint, can you move your leg back behind your pelvis? Do you have enough yield in your hip flexor muscles, and do you have enough strength in your glutes and your hamstrings to be able to accomplish that? And for most people, the answer is no or barely. So shifting this pattern involves a few things. We have to decrease the amount of time we spend with our hip flexors in a shortened position, which means we need to decrease our quantity of sitting. And then we also need to strengthen the glutes and the hamstrings so that they can start picking up the slack and doing what they are supposed to do. Now, why is this relevant to pelvic floor health? Well, I've mentioned earlier how walking is such a valuable activity. We talked a little bit about how it utilizes the gluteus medius muscles, those muscles that we tested when we did the pelvic list or stood on one leg. Ideally, when we walk, we are moving, we're pushing back with our standing leg to move the rest of our body forward. You can think of it like paddling. So if you are in a canoe or a gondola, you're putting your paddle down into the water and you're pushing back to propel the boat forward. We have this same reflexive gait pattern in our body, except it's been corrupted. The software has gotten a virus, shall we say, and it's not working the way it's designed because of habits that we have, because of how we've modeled our walking based on who we've seen around us. Who did we grow up around? How did they walk? What was our own body patterning before we even began walking? So there's a lot of things that factor in. But ideally, when we walk, we're pushing back on our standing leg to propel the rest of the body forward. And in that process, we're then utilizing the glutes with every step we take. And we're stabilizing our sacrum with every step we take. And we're utilizing our hamstrings with every step we take. And we're also utilizing the calf muscles, which we didn't touch on today, but that is another piece of the puzzle. And then we're also, as I mentioned earlier, using the gluteus medius muscles, which ultimately help stabilize the pelvis so that we have this really nice, stable pelvic bowl that supports the function of the pelvic floor muscles. And they're all working together. Nothing is working in isolation. Nothing ever works in isolation. And I could ripple this out further to bring in the psoas muscles and to bring in what's going on with the abdomen and to bring in what's going on with the shoulders and the chest muscles and the neck. But we have to stop this somewhere or else we're going to be here for hours.